What happens when a waitress's sharp words backfire after discovering her customer is Barron Trump? The morning rush was in full swing at Moonlight Café, a small but lively spot in downtown Austin, Texas. The smell of fresh coffee beans mixed with the sweet aroma of baked pastries as regulars filed in, chatting about everything from work deadlines to weekend plans. Behind the counter, Carly, a spirited waitress in her mid-20s, moved with practiced efficiency. She was known for her sharp wit and her tendency to voice her opinions, a trait some found endearing, others less so. It was just another typical day for Carly until the door swung open, the jingling bell momentarily interrupting the hum of conversation. In walked a tall, well-dressed man, perhaps in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet confidence. Beside him was a teenage boy, lanky and awkward, in the way that only adolescents can be. His blonde hair fell slightly into his eyes, and his gaze stayed low as if trying to avoid attention. Carly didn't recognize them as regulars. Something about the pair piqued her curiosity, but she quickly dismissed it as they slid into a corner booth. She approached with her usual enthusiasm, pen and notepad in hand, ready to take their order. As she got closer, the man gave her a polite smile, while the boy avoided eye contact, studying the menu intently. "So, what'll it be today?" Carly asked, her voice carrying over the background noise of clinking dishes and steaming milk. The man looked up and said, "Just 2 coffees, black and a blueberry muffin." Carly scribbled on her notepad, glancing at the boy. "What about you, sweetheart? Nothing else for breakfast?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "No, thank you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Something about his demeanor caught Carly off guard. He seemed timid, almost as if he didn't belong. But before she could think much about it, her mind wandered to another thought. There was something familiar about his face. She couldn't place it, but the nagging sensation lingered. As she walked back to the counter to place their order, her curiosity turned to speculation. Who were they? Tourists, maybe? Business partners? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. But Carly's thoughts soon took a sharp turn when she overheard a snippet of their conversation, sparking the beginnings of her own assumptions. As Carly returned to the counter, her ears perked up, catching snippets of their hushed conversation. The older man spoke with a calm and measured tone, but it was the boy's quiet replies that piqued her interest. His words were polite but subdued, almost like he was walking on eggshells. Carly's curiosity began to twist into something else, judgment. She set the coffee mugs and muffin on a tray, muttering to herself, "Looks like another entitled father-son duo. Probably never worked a day in their lives." Her co-worker, Nina, glanced up with raised eyebrows but didn't comment. Carly had a habit of making snap judgments, and today seemed no different. As she approached their table, she noticed the older man glance at his phone, briefly typing something. The boy sat motionless, staring out the window with an almost wistful expression. Carly placed the mugs on the table with a bit more force than necessary, the clink of porcelain breaking the quiet between them. "Anything else you two need?" she asked, her tone slightly sharper this time. The man smiled politely and shook his head. "No, thank you. This is perfect." But Carly wasn't done. As she turned to walk away, she paused, her voice rising just enough for nearby patrons to hear. "You know, it's nice to see young people out with their parents for a change. Most kids these days are glued to their phones, or causing a scene somewhere." The older man looked up, startled, but said nothing. The boy's face turned pink, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The comment lingered awkwardly in the air, drawing a few curious glances from other tables. Carly walked back to the counter, feeling a mix of satisfaction and unease. She didn't like the way the boy's reaction had made her feel almost guilty, though she quickly pushed the thought aside. She leaned on the counter, her eyes fixed on the pair as they sipped their coffee. The cafe had quieted down some, and a group of regulars near the back whispered among themselves. One of them, a middle-aged woman in a floral dress, caught Carly's attention. "Hey," the woman called softly, gesturing her over. "Do you know who that is?" Carly frowned and shook her head. "No clue. Just another customer." The woman leaned in, lowering her voice as if revealing a secret. "That's Barron Trump." Carly blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "You're kidding," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and skepticism. "No way. What would he be doing here?" The woman shrugged. "I'm just saying, he looks exactly like him. And the man with him. Probably Secret Service or something." Carly's stomach tightened, but she masked it with a scoff. "Well, if it is him, maybe he could use a slice of humble pie." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Carly's mind began to spin, her assumptions battling against the nagging possibility that this wasn't just an ordinary customer. The air in the cafe shifted as the woman's whispered comments spread. A few patrons started stealing glances at the corner booth, their curiosity barely concealed. Carly, now back behind the counter, tried to appear unfazed, but her thoughts were racing. Could it really be Barron Trump? The reserved demeanor, the older man's composed presence. It added up. She found herself staring, searching for more clues in the boy's posture, his expressions. Yet a twinge of defiance crept in. Even if it was him, so what? Carly wasn't one to hold back her opinions, no matter who was in the room. The tension in the cafe grew thicker when one of the regulars, a man in his 40s wearing a baseball cap, leaned over to Carly. "You know," he said with a smirk, "if that's who we think it is, you better watch your mouth. People are going to talk." Carly rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the prick of self-consciousness. Why? He's just a kid. And anyway, everyone's got to hear the truth sometime. Still, she felt a growing weight as she carried a water refill to their table. The older man met her gaze with a calm but firm look, like he knew exactly what was happening. The boy, though, seemed oblivious, or perhaps he was simply used to it. His gaze stayed fixed on the table, his hands lightly gripping the edge of his mug. "So," Carly said, her voice carrying a hint of sarcasm, "enjoying your coffee?" The older man nodded. "It's excellent, thank you." Carly hesitated, her voice dropping slightly. "And you, sweetheart? Still holding out on breakfast?" The boy finally looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "No, I'm fine, thank you." For a moment, the room seemed to shrink. His voice wasn't defensive or confrontational. It was kind. Too kind, Carly thought, for someone who probably lived in a bubble of privilege. "Must be nice," she said, more to herself than to them. "Not having to worry about much. Just sitting here, sipping coffee while the rest of us deal with everything else." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. The boy looked down again, his face unreadable. A hush fell over the cafe, the tension now palpable. Carly turned on her heel and walked back to the counter, her cheeks burning. She didn't understand why their silence bothered her so much. It wasn't like she'd said anything wrong, right? The baseball cap man chuckled quietly. "Guess you told them," he muttered. Carly gave a weak smile but felt a pang of discomfort. Her words had landed, but the reaction she'd expected, a defensive retort, a flash of entitlement, hadn't come. Instead, there was just quiet. But that quiet was deafening, and as Carly busied herself with cleaning an already spotless counter, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something bigger was about to happen. As Carly pretended to busy herself at the counter, the tension in the cafe continued to simmer. Patrons whispered in hushed tones, occasionally sneaking glances at the corner booth. The older man and the boy, however, remained composed, seemingly unaffected by the stares and murmurs. Finally, the older man set down his coffee mug and stood up, smoothing his jacket with deliberate movements. The boy glanced up at him, his expression calm but uncertain. Carly watched them out of the corner of her eye, her curiosity now impossible to ignore. Something about the man's steady demeanor and the boy's quiet poise gnawed at her. The man walked up to the counter, placing a crisp $20 bill on the edge. "Thank you for the coffee," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It was excellent." Carly, caught off guard by the directness of his tone, nodded. "Sure thing," she said, trying to match his energy. "Hope you enjoyed your visit." The man's gaze didn't waver. He leaned in slightly, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I don't appreciate the assumptions you've made about my son today. You don't know him, and you don't know us." Carly felt a lump rise in her throat, but before she could respond, the man straightened and continued, his tone calm yet sharp enough to cut through the din of the cafe. "For the record, his name is Barron Trump." The room fell silent as if someone had flipped a switch. Every eye turned toward the corner booth, where the boy sat quietly, his face partially hidden by his hair. Carly's breath caught in her chest. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Her mind raced. She wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. The man didn't wait for her to recover. He stepped back toward the booth, placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder, and guided him to his feet. The boy followed without protest, his movements deliberate and composed. He glanced briefly at Carly as they passed, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no smugness, just a kind of weary understanding that made Carly's stomach churn. The pair reached the door, and just before stepping out, the man turned back to the cafe. "Next time," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "try seeing people for who they are, not who you think they are." With that, they were gone, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Carly stood frozen behind the counter, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and judgment. But what stung more than their stares was the realization that, for the first time, Carly wasn't sure if she had been in the right. The cafe remained unusually quiet after Barron and the man left. Carly felt rooted in place, her thoughts a chaotic mess. The man's words echoed in her mind, louder than the hum of the coffee machine or the faint chatter that was slowly resuming among the patrons. She had never considered herself wrong. Opinionated, sure, but wrong? That was a new and uncomfortable feeling. Nina, her co-worker, approached cautiously, leaning on the counter. "You okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carly hesitated before shaking her head. "I don't know," she admitted, surprising even herself. "I mean, I wasn't that harsh, right?" Nina's expression softened, but she didn't offer immediate reassurance. "You kind of went for them, Carly. And, I mean, if that really was Barron Trump..." She trailed off, glancing toward the door as if expecting them to reappear. Carly sighed, her bravado deflating. "It's not like I said anything terrible. I don't know. I thought I was standing up for something." One of the regulars, an older woman named Teresa, chimed in from her nearby seat. "Standing up for what, honey? You didn't know a thing about them." Carly looked at her, surprised by the gentle but firm tone. Teresa had always been chatty, but this was different. "What's that supposed to mean?" Carly asked defensively. "It means you jump to conclusions," Teresa replied, setting her mug down with a soft clink. "You saw a kid and made up a whole story in your head about who he was. And then you acted on it. That's not standing up for anything. That's letting your assumptions run the show." Carly opened her mouth to respond, but found she had nothing to say. Teresa's words stung because they rang true. She thought back to the boy's quiet demeanor, the way he hadn't retaliated or even looked annoyed. He just endured it. Another patron, a middle-aged man sipping his coffee, added, "You know, I'm no fan of his dad, but that kid didn't deserve any of that. He's probably got enough to deal with just being who he is." Carly's stomach churned. She felt exposed, as though her actions had been laid bare for everyone to see. The thought of the boy's expression, the quiet composure masking something deeper, refused to leave her mind. Finally, Teresa spoke again, her voice softer this time. "Look, Carly, we all make snap judgments. It's human. But it takes a bigger person to admit when they've been unfair and try to do better next time." Carly nodded slowly, her defenses crumbling. She knew Teresa was right. Maybe she'd been so focused on making a point that she hadn't stopped to think about the person in front of her. Barron Trump or not, he'd just been a kid, polite, reserved, and undeserving of her hostility. But the question now was what Carly would do with this newfound understanding, whether she'd let it change her or dismiss it as just another uncomfortable moment to forget. The day dragged on, but Carly couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. Every customer that came in seemed to blur together, their voices distant as her mind replayed the events from earlier. She thought about the boy, Barron. How he'd looked at her with those calm blue eyes, not with anger or defiance, but with a quiet understanding that made her feel small. During a lull in the afternoon, Carly found herself wiping the counter, though it was already spotless. Teresa's words echoed in her mind. It's not standing up for anything. That's letting your assumptions run the show. The truth of it hit her harder now than it had in the moment. She had prided herself on being outspoken, unafraid to voice her beliefs. But today, her voice hadn't been a weapon for justice. It had been a weapon of judgment. Her co-worker Nina broke the silence. You've been quiet all day. You sure you're okay? Carly sighed, leaning against the counter. I can't stop thinking about it. That kid. He didn't deserve any of that, did he? Nina tilted her head, studying her. Probably not. But what matters is what you do with that. Everyone messes up, Carly. It's how you handle it afterward that counts. Carly nodded, her throat tightening. She thought back to the moment the man had revealed Barron's identity, how the boy had silently followed him out without a single word of complaint or anger. She'd assumed he was entitled, yet he'd shown more grace in that moment than she had all day. Later that evening, as the cafe was closing, Carly sat down at one of the empty booths, her apron folded neatly on the table in front of her. She stared out the window at the darkening sky, her thoughts heavy. She wanted to apologize, but it wasn't like she'd see them again. They were probably already halfway across the city, maybe even the state. Still, she couldn't let the moment pass without some kind of change. She pulled out her phone and opened a blank notes app. The words came slowly at first, but then they poured out. An open letter to Barron Trump. She didn't know if he'd ever see it, but it felt like the right thing to do. I owe you an apology, she typed. I didn't see you as a person today, and for that, I'm truly sorry. You showed more kindness and restraint than I deserved, and I want you to know that your actions didn't go unnoticed. You reminded me of something important, that respect and understanding should come before judgment, always. She paused, rereading the words before adding one final line. Thank you for teaching me something I needed to learn. But even as she hit save, Carly knew the real change wouldn't come from the letter. It would come from what she chose to do the next time she faced a moment like this. The following morning, Carly arrived at the cafe early. The air was crisp, and the usual bustle of downtown Austin was just beginning to pick up. As she unlocked the doors, she couldn't help but reflect on the weight of the previous day. Something inside her felt different. Heavier, yes, but also clearer, as though a veil had been lifted. As the day unfolded, Carly found herself looking at her customers differently. The older man carefully stirring sugar into his coffee, the teenager scrolling through their phone while waiting for a friend, the businesswoman juggling a phone call and a laptop, they all seemed more human. She began to wonder about their stories, their struggles, and the things that shaped them. The judgments she'd once made so quickly felt misplaced now. During a mid-morning lull, Teresa strolled in and took her usual seat near the window. Carly brought her a coffee, unprompted, and sat down across from her. Teresa looked surprised but smiled warmly. Morning, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Teresa asked, her tone light but curious. Carly hesitated, then said, You were right yesterday. About everything. I was so quick to make assumptions about that boy and his dad. I thought I was standing up for something, but I was just wrong. Teresa sipped her coffee and nodded thoughtfully. Well, recognizing that is a good start. Most people don't even get that far. I wrote something, Carly said, pulling out her phone. It's like an apology. I don't know if he'll ever see it, but it felt like the right thing to do. Teresa smiled. It's not about whether he sees it, honey. It's about you acknowledging it. That's the part that matters. For the rest of the day, Carly carried a quiet sense of purpose. Every interaction felt like an opportunity, a chance to listen instead of assume, to respond instead of react. She didn't need to change the world overnight, but she could start by changing herself. And that, she realized, was a powerful beginning. That evening, as Carly closed up the cafe, she thought about Barron and his quiet strength. He hadn't said much, but his presence had left an impact far greater than words. Carly smiled to herself, a small but genuine smile, as she locked the door and stepped out into the cool night air. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she could carry the lesson forward. She could be better. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Stories like this remind us of the power of empathy and understanding. Before we judge, before we assume, let's take a moment to see the person in front of us for who they truly are. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content. Let's spread the message of respect and kindness, one story at a time.